Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. It's an intellectual intervention.
I think that's a great way to put it.
We're going to dive deep into a pretty radical idea that the global order we all live in, the one that's sold to us as this neutral, rational, always improving system.
The only game in town.
Exactly. That this system is actually unstable. That it's incoherent at its core and maybe, just maybe, completely indefensible.
And that is precisely our mission today. We're going to crack open a really dense, but I think vital work from the young comparative scholar Hassan Spiker.
His new book, right?
His newest book, The Unravelling of Intelligibility, Elements of Modernity. And Spiker's diagnosis is, it's devastating.
It really is.
He's saying that all these crises we see everywhere, the political system fracturing, the moral failures we see on the news, even the really personal stuff like identity crises and the epidemic of mental illness.
But none of this is an accident.
Not at all. He argues they're the inevitable structural consequences, a kind of trickle-down effect from 5 huge historical fractures in Western thought.
So this isn't just about analyzing a political moment. We're doing a kind of intellectual archaeology.
Yes.
We're going to unpack Spiker's core argument that modernity is this crumbling wall and it's being held up by these really complicated, often distracting stories.
And the result of all this.
The result is that we're now living in what he calls a post-morality age.
And before we get into the book itself, I think it's really crucial to understand Spiker's whole project. What's driving him?
Right. What's his mission?
This is a scholar who is relentlessly focused on objective reality. I mean, he is seeking nothing less than the recovery and the firm establishment of objective truth through traditional metaphysics.
Okay, so that's a big concept, metaphysics.
It is. But for Spiker, it's the absolute foundation. It's the only thing that can really push back against the forces that are consuming us now. Subjectivity, relativism, nihilism. I mean, if truth is just relative, then
everything is just a power game.
Everything.
Yeah.
All moral claims, all rational arguments, they just become arbitrary. And that, he says, is where the real collapse begins.
And this new book, it feels like it's the practical application of work he's been doing for years, right? It's building on his earlier, much more philosophical research.
Absolutely. His previous work really laid the groundwork. His book from 2021, The Tangled Knot, was already seen as a kind of seminal work in comparative philosophy.
What was the focus there?
It was heavily focused on a concept called nafs al-amr, which you can loosely translate as the self of reality.
The objective nature of things.
Exactly, the objective metaphysical nature of things. It was all about establishing that foundation of objective truth.
Yeah.
It's a really rigorous text, and it shows his mastery of ilm al-kalam.
Okay, so ilm al-kalam, that's a weighty term. For a learner who maybe isn't steeped in that tradition, what does that mean? What does mastering scholastic theology bring to a critique of modern philosophy?
That's a great question, because it positions him so uniquely against the Western tradition. Kalam is, it's essentially a method of rigorous rational defense.
Sense of what?
Of theological and metaphysical truths
Yeah.
against philosophical skepticism. So while you have someone like Kant in the West famously dismantling metaphysics, saying it's impossible,
Right.
Spiker's coming from a tradition that spent centuries perfecting the rational defense of metaphysics. He's approaching the problem from a position of, intellectual strength.
Which leads right into his next book.
Precisely. In 2022, he published The Metrical Critique of Kant on the possibility of metaphysics.
A direct challenge.
A direct confrontation. It's a short, dense book that goes right at Kant's philosophical revolution, that moment in the West when the question shifted from what is truth to...
Is truth even possible?
Is metaphysics even possible? Exactly. And Spiker's line is, look, if you allow the denial of metaphysics, then the denial of religion, of universal morality, of the concept of God.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a few short, logical steps away.
So you have to fight the battle at the foundation.
You have to start the fight at the bedrock of truth itself, not at the level of policy debates.
So this new book, The Unravelling of Intelligibility, it feels like Spiker is coming down from those, lofty towers of high philosophy.
I think
He's trying to show us, the public, the practical real-world consequences of all this. He wants to demonstrate that trickle-down effect, how a crisis that started with people like Kant and Descartes is now showing up in your culture, your media, the fact that nobody trusts institutions anymore.
It really moves the discussion from, abstraction to application. It's a kind of admonition to the learner that these aren't just mental gymnastics for some elite thinkers.
No, it's in the air we breathe.
It saturates the air we breathe. It impacts our culture, our media, our universities. The whole thesis is that the underlying assumptions of the modern project, the things we just treat as facts,
Those are the things that have to be exposed.
they have to be exposed and interrogated.
Okay, so let's unpack this core problem that Spiker identifies. And he starts by giving a name to the system he's critiquing, right? He says it's not just modernity.
No, it's a very specific, deeply entrenched construct.
Mm.
And he simplifies it with this really powerful acronym, COLMES.
S. What does that stand for?
It stands for the Civilization of Liberal Universal Modernity, Neutral and Scientific.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but it's a great conceptual tool, because the genius of Spiker's critique here is that he recognizes that modernity's success, its triumph, has made its own assumptions invisible to us.
We can't see the water we're swimming in.
Exactly. It's won so thoroughly that its foundations just aren't questioned anymore.
And he actually pulls in Nietzsche here to make this point about invisibility.
He does.
Yeah.
And the quote is perfect. To paraphrase, it's something like, "We can no longer see it because it has been victorious."
That's a chilling thought.
It perfectly sums up the illusion Spiker's trying to shatter. Because Calmes has won, militarily, economically, culturally, it's now perceived as the only necessary civilization. It's the standard that every other culture has to be measured against.
And this leads to something he calls universal invisibility.
Yes. Universal invisibility.
Mm.
It's this idea that no real alternative seems possible or even, imaginable.
The building blocks of the system, the secular state, the scientific method, individual rights, the free market, they just feel natural.
Like the weather, eternal.
Yeah.
And when you internalize that structure, any fundamental critique starts to sound like, well, insanity.
And this natural feeling is key to understanding the book's title, right? The Unravelling of Intelligibility.
It is. That's the technical term for the core process he's documenting. It's the process by which certain ultimate human concerns, moral choices, fundamental norms,
Big stuff.
the big stuff, the things that are supposed to anchor us, all of those things are being revealed day by day as arbitrary.
Or just subjective, based on feelings.
Right. Or based purely on dogmatic will voluntarism, rather than on any kind of universal or objective truth.
Can you give us a practical example of how this unraveling affects us? Because it sounds very abstract, but I think the consequences are things we see every day.
Sure. Think about an institution that used to be considered, immovable, like the definition of marriage, or even just the binary understanding of gender.
Things that were just taken for granted for centuries.
For millennia. Historically, these concepts were moored in something, in metaphysics, in biology, in shared cultural and religious understanding. But when those metaphysical foundations collapse, when the ought is totally divorced from the s,
Then the only thing left is individual preference.
individual preference or subjective feeling, which then has to be mediated by the state, by legislation.
So we see these huge rapid shifts in social norms that used to feel universal, and then those new norms have to be enforced by power, by coercion, because the shared moral reason for them is gone.
Exactly. When those ultimate concerns are shown to be fluid or purely subjective, it forces people to realize that the order they live in is actually failing.
Failing to do what?
Failing to produce a coherent and self-consistent justification for its own fundamental beliefs. It becomes what he calls the indefensible order.
It can't defend itself.
It simply cannot defend its own core values anymore without resorting to, circular logic or just brute force.
And we are seeing the results of this decay everywhere.
Everywhere. I mean, we're seeing these constant obituaries for the liberal order. It's a philosophical decay that really follows Nietzsche's whole death of God metaphor.
The big alternatives are failing.
Exactly. Spiker notes that the grand projects established after that metaphysical death are now crumbling. We saw communism fall, and now the global liberal order itself is being questioned, mourned, or just actively rejected all over the world.
And the cost is deeply personal, which I think is why this critique is hitting home for so many people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
On a personal level, the consequences are severe. You have crises of identity and self-definition. You have the rapid acceleration of mental health epidemics, the breakdown of the family unit.
I mean, if your ultimate norms are arbitrary, how do you build a stable self?
How can you? And then politically, the very legitimacy of liberal democracy is being questioned. That idea of tolerance, which was supposed to be inherent in liberal pluralism, is collapsing.
Why is it collapsing?
Because it has no foundational reason to tolerate dissenters who reject its now arbitrary foundations. There's no why left.
This brings us to probably the most unsettling critique Spiker makes, which is the arrival of the post-morality age. He's saying we're beyond simple immorality. We're now in a time where the very capacity for universal moral judgment has just disintegrated. It's given way to raw power interests.
And he illustrates this so forcefully using the recent events in Gaza.
Which is obviously a hugely charged example.
Incredibly charged. But he argues that the stated values of COMES, the commitment to international law, to human rights, they simply vacate ratification. They get thrown out the window when they conflict with the power interests of the system's main players.
And the result?
The result is the justification of actions like the murder of children or genocide, when they're framed within the context of state security or national interest.
That is a massive claim. Spiker is essentially saying the self-correction mechanism the West is so proud of.
The ability to look at its own past wrongs and fix them.
Right. He's saying that mechanism is failing, or maybe it never really existed outside the limits of power.
He points specifically to major intellectual figures, people like Habermas, Zizek, Jordan Peterson, who were either silent or, in some cases, actively defending certain actions during this period.
And for Spiker, that's the proof.
For him, it's proof that the crisis has metastasized. It's moved beyond politics and into the intellectual conscience of the West. Their response shows that the system will always prioritize its own power interests over any pretense of universal morality.
The dialogue stops.
The dialogue stops and the approval of atrocity begins as long as it serves the power structure.
So all that human rights talk, the supposed moral core of comms, it's just reduced to lip service.
It confirms that the order can and will approve any action, even genocide, when it aligns with its geopolitical interests. It is a cynical, post-moral state where moral standards become, well, irrelevant.
Okay, so if the foundations are so clearly crumbling, why hasn't there been a more unified response? Why aren't more people seeing this?
Well, Spiker addresses this directly. He positions postmodernism itself as a kind of red herring.
A distraction.
A huge distraction. He says it's not an escape from modernity, but a really complicated, obscure narrative that's actually designed to prop up the falling wall of the modern project.
So postmodernism, with all its deconstruction and rejection of grand narratives, it's actually a defense mechanism.
Precisely. By framing the project as postmodern or late modern, it keeps alive this idea that the project is just unfinished.
It keeps hope alive.
It does. And it prevents people from looking backward, from looking toward pre-modern foundations, the Greco-Roman world, the Christian era, or other civilizations, for real alternatives. It creates this distracting, highly intellectual layer of complexity that keeps everyone's focus moving forward, and subtly supports the West's dominance in a new, more cynical form. It actively discourages the kind of deep dive into metaphysics that Spiker is demanding.
So this whole philosophical critique, this unraveling of modernity's intellectual core, leads us right into the second major theme of the book, which is how the colonized world, and Spiker focuses a lot on the Muslim world here, how it internalized this idea of a Western intellectual victory.
This is where he identifies what he calls the catching up syndrome.
Catching up syndrome.
Yes, he observes this pervasive, almost desperate belief, especially post-colonization, that they must adopt modern education, industrialism, technology, just to compete.
It's a race.
It's an urgent race to match the outward appearance of Western progress, and in doing so, they mistake that technological power for genuine intellectual superiority.
And this drive, this need to catch up, it leads them right into what he calls the apologetic trap.
Which he says manifests in two really problematic ways.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the belief that to be truly independent, you have to adopt the colonizers' structures, their political science, their secular education systems, their economic models.
The irony there is just staggering.
It's tragic. They believe they can use the very tools that caused the civilizational sickness to somehow achieve the cure. They import the ideological virus along with the technology.
And the second trap, he says this one is more contemporary, more subtle.
It is. It's the pervasive mantra of women empowerment.
Okay, explain that, because on the surface, that sounds like a good thing.
And this is why it's such a clever trap. Spiker notes that many national projects, even some supported by religious political parties who are supposedly resisting the West, they promote this concept as the key to liberating their country, to showing they're making progress. But the intellectual trap is this. They're embracing concepts of empowerment and equality, that come directly from the Western ideological framework.
The very framework built on the 5 philosophical ruptures we're about to discuss.
Exactly. They're adopting the symptom as the cure without ever realizing the source of the disease.
This brings us to a really crucial distinction that a lot of thinkers try to make, especially non-Western liberals.
The separation of modernity from Westernism.
Right. And he uses the Indian liberal Gurcharan Das as an example here.
Das's argument is incredibly influential, especially among the global educated middle class. He basically says that modernity, so technology, science, secularization, efficient government, is universal.
And that's separate from Westernism.
Which he defines as, the frivolous stuff, immorality, pop culture, vulgarity. For him, modernity is a common heritage for all rational, civilized human beings.
But Spiker's critique of this is sharp, isn't it?
Very sharp. He says this perspective just completely ignores modernity's specific, highly non-neutral European origins. It ignores the fragmented ideology it's built on.
Spiker finds this whole position to be a paradox.
It's a total paradox. Philosophically, modernity is the most fragmented civilization in history because it's based on these separations, these ruptures, yet it's the one that claims the status of being universal, of being the ultimate self of reality.
It's a European-centric worldview pretending to be a necessary universal one.
And to accept that separation between modernity and Westernism is to ignore the historical cause and effect.
So why? Why did so many thinkers, particularly in the Muslim world that Spiker focuses on, fall into this trap? Why did they concede intellectual superiority just because they lost on the battlefield?
Well, it was historical trauma, for one. A deep, deep civilizational shock. Spiker looks at the historical texts that really define that reaction. He cites a very influential scholar, Abu al-Hassan Ali Nadwi.
In his book, What the World Lost by the Decline of Muslims.
Right. And while Spiker acknowledges Nadwi's sincerity and piety, he frames this kind of work as essential apologetic literature.
And what's the problem with apologetic literature?
The key problem is that Nadwi focused so heavily on Muslim negligence, on what Muslims did wrong. And in doing so, he painted what Spiker calls a rosy picture of Europe's scientific progress and its intellectual effort.
But that rosy picture leaves out some pretty important details.
It leaves out the most important detail. It completely overlooks the actual foundation of Western power.
Which was not purely intellectual or scientific.
Far from it. That power was built, as Spiker just lays it out, on oppression, plunder, resource extraction, race, slavery, and colonization.
So by focusing only on internal Muslim weakness, this literature puts the Muslim world in the dock, forcing it to defend itself.
Instead of thoroughly interrogating the violent, brutal history and the intellectual incoherence of the conqueror.
Which brings us to the most crucial misunderstanding of all, one identified by Mustafa Sabri, the last Ottoman Sheikh-ul-Islam.
Sabri's words are just chillingly relevant today.
What did he say?
He argued that the great error was that Muslims mistook martial victory for intellectual victory.
Wow.
They conceded intellectual and civilizational superiority simply because the West won the war, because they had better technology, because they built impressive infrastructure. Military defeat was mistakenly translated into civilizational defeat.
And that blinded them to the possibility that technological dominance has nothing to do with having a superior intellectual or spiritual foundation.
Nothing at all.
To really drive this point home, Spiker uses a powerful case study of an intellectual who completely internalized Western dominance, V.S. Naipaul.
Naipaul is the perfect archetype here, the Nobel laureate from Trinidad. He's the figure who completely accepts the premise of universal invisibility.
He saw Western civilization as the universal civilization.
He did, and he justified its hegemonic status, even while acknowledging its racial taint. For Naipaul, the pursuit of happiness, individual choice, material success, these were the highest values. He basically accepted John Locke's pragmatic ethics as the highest good.
But the real confrontation Spiker highlights is Naipaul's very specific hostility towards Islam.
Yes, Naipaul saw Islam as the arch nemesis of humanistic universality.
Why? What was his argument?
He argued that Islamic imperialism was fundamentally worse, more colonizing, than European conquest.
How could he possibly argue that?
Because, he claimed, Islam demanded a complete metamorphosis of culture, a total identity change from anyone who embraced it. He suggested Islamic conquest was worse because it dissolved existing cultures entirely.
But that's a very weak historical argument, and Spiker counters it directly by citing the legal reality of Islamic civilization.
He does. He points to the legal dictum al-ada muhakama.
Which means?
It translates as, custom has the power of law. This principle actually enshrined cultural pluralism under Islamic rule. It protected local customs.
And he gives concrete examples.
He gives many. Christian Orthodox communities flourishing for centuries in Istanbul, Jewish communities thriving in Andalusia, early Islamic architecture, like the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, literally incorporating Byzantine mosaic work into its structure.
And you can't forget the cultural syncretism, the mixing in places like the Indian subcontinent.
Exactly. The Chishti Sufi order, for instance, embraced and cultivated traditional Indian music. That's how you get the development of Qawwali. It demonstrates that the civilization allowed for, even encouraged, the protection of local customs. It's the exact opposite of Naipaul's claim.
So the cultural metamorphosis was a spiritual choice, not a material imposition like Western colonization.
A completely different model. The key takeaway from this whole section is that the colonized mind accepts the West's definition of progress technology machines as a sign of moral and intellectual superiority. And by doing that, they jump on the bandwagon of a system, call MS, that Spiker has just shown, is based on total moral and intellectual incoherence.
Okay, so let's go back to the source of that incoherence. Let's get into the deep history. All right, this is where we move from the consequences, the built world, the colonized mindset back to the intellectual archaeology of the crisis.
Yeah.
This is the sequence of events, the historical deep dive that created the modern fragmented mind.
Yes.
Spiker identifies 5 critical ruptures or severances that he says detached modern thought from the traditional Christian era worldview.
And this section is so important because it proves that modernity isn't some organic, natural evolution. It's a series of radical, systemic breaks. It's an epistemic rupture.
Most historians focus on the Enlightenment, but Spiker goes way further back.
Much further back. He argues the rupture began almost at the very beginning of Christian thought in the West.
Okay, let's start with Severance 1, Law and Spirit. He traces this to early Pauline Christianity. That is a massive historical claim. Does he back it up?
It's a bold claim, for sure, but he argues its intellectual consequence is undeniable. He says the severance originated with St. Paul's efforts to turn Christianity from a localized covenantal faith into a universal missionary religion.
One that could appeal to non-Jews?
Exactly. And to do that, it had to be accessible beyond the strictures of Jewish law. This led to what's called antinomianism, basically, being against the law. It neutralized the role of moral law, the nomos, in Christian life.
So the spiritual domain was consciously and deliberately separated from the domain of daily law?
That's the move. The consequence was the creation of a watered-down version of divine law. The divine command was effectively removed from what Spiker calls real everyday life, REL.
So you create 2 separate realms.
You have a spiritual realm, salvation, grace, faith, and then you have the secular day-to-day realm. And if the divine law is removed from everyday life, well, humans rush in to fill that vacuum with their own laws, arbitrary legislation.
And that's the beginning of secularization in practice.
It's the seed. And it leads directly to severance too. Spiritual power and temporal power in the early Middle Ages.
This is the famous structural split, isn't it?
The big one. The division between the authority of the papacy, the church, representing spiritual power, and the empire, the king, representing temporal political power.
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
And unto God what is God's. That phrase, which sounds like a compromise, actually institutionalized division. It created 2 separate spheres of influence.
And historically, this wasn't a peaceful separation. It was a constant institutional conflict, a tug of war.
A constant tug of war. The battles between popes and kings, like Pope Boniface VIII versus King Philip IV, were crucial. This conflict created a precedent for 2 separate abstract powers operating independently of each other.
And what's the implication for the modern world?
Spiker says this duality is simply reproduced today in the struggle between the state, which is a legal entity, and the market or the corporation, also a legal entity. But eventually the state won out. It completely replaced God and the church as the ultimate secular source of authority for all worldly matters.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the next famous break in the late Middle Ages. Severance 3, Faith and Reason. And this crisis was sparked because certain core Christian doctrines, especially the Trinity and the Incarnation, were just inherently difficult, if not impossible, to justify using pure reason, especially Aristotelian philosophy.
And that difficulty led to 3 very different philosophical positions. The first was harmony, championed by Anselm, who argued there was no contradiction at all, full intelligibility.
And the second?
Compatibility. This is Thomas Aquinas. He created that famous 2-story model. Grace and nature are distinct, but they can be reconciled. It's a bit like the idea of non-overlapping magisteria you hear about today.
But the really decisive break came with the third position, conflict, or fideism.
This is where William of Ockham and Martin Luther become absolutely pivotal. Ockham's nominalism suggested that God's command was arbitrary. God commanded it simply because he willed it, not because it was tied to some objective reason or morality.
Divine voluntarism.
Exactly. And then Luther just radicalized this position. He created an extreme antagonism towards reason itself.
I mean, he famously called reason the devil's greatest whore. That's not subtle rhetoric.
Not at all. And it had devastating consequences for the traditional view. It ensured that faith was seen as inherently irrational or even absurd. Credo quia absurdum, I believe, because it is absurd.
And what's the long-term result of that separation?
Crucially, this extreme separation laid the ideological groundwork for secular reason. By casting reason out of the house of theology, it was simultaneously liberated to go off and develop on its own, free from religious interference. And so a purely secular, often anti-religious reason was born.
Okay, moving into early modernity, we hit the big one for epistemology. Severance 4, the natural world and the knowing subject, the Cartesian split.
The famous split from René Descartes. He bifurcated reality. He created the physical, quantifiable natural world, the res extensa as a kind of machine, and the subjective, knowing human subject, the res cogitans, as the mind, the ghost in the machine.
And this fundamentally changed what nature even means.
Completely. Nature stopped being a collection of God's signs, a kind of intelligible book you could read for meaning. It just became a mechanistic object to be dissected, measured, and manipulated.
And this severance involved the deliberate removal of final causes, right? The telos, the ultimate purpose of things.
Absolutely. The new science rejected any reference to ultimate purpose or metaphysical origins. Descartes explicitly said we should avoid talking about final causes in physics because that belongs to theology.
So the only thing that matters is what you can measure.
If you can't quantify it, it's irrelevant. And this is the intellectual engine behind the uniformity of modern architecture and industrial production that we'll talk about in a minute.
And the goal of knowledge itself changed. It shifted from wisdom to utility.
Galileo said the new science wasn't speculative philosophy. It was a practical philosophy that would be very useful in life. Knowledge became utilitarian, pragmatic. The ambition shifted from understanding God's design to gaining power.
The goal became to be the lords and masters of nature.
The total control over the external world.
And this leads us to the final devastating break. Severance 5, morality and ontology. The ultimate separation of what is from what ought to be.
This is the loss of isomorphism, that correspondence between existence and morality. The rise of Renaissance humanism and later political philosophy with Machiavelli and Hobbes basically reduced man to a machine.
A machine driven by what?
By natural drives and instincts, a competition for self-interest and self-preservation. Man was stripped of his higher spiritual essence. All that's left is the material, striving animal.
And John Locke is the one who really cemented this pragmatic ethics, dismissing the entire classical pursuit of the summum bonum, the highest good, as a total waste of time.
A complete waste of effort. Locke advocated for immediate physical well-being. He shifted the focus away from virtue and contemplation and prioritized sensory experience and comfort. The book quotes him advocating for physical happiness. Let us eat and drink. Let us enjoy what we delight in, for tomorrow we shall die.
And that pursuit of immediate material comfort ironically becomes the defining characteristic of the very civilization that someone like Naipaul would later praise as universal.
The circle closes.
So these 5 ruptures, law from spirit, temporal from spiritual, faith from reason, world from subject, and morality from being, these are, according to Spiker, the philosophical engine that created the modern crisis we're living in today.
It's a structural argument. The modern world, Calms, isn't built on a positive foundation. It's built on a series of historical denials, of severances. So is it any surprise that a civilization founded on 5 divorces is failing to find any internal coherence?
I think the genius of Spiker's book is that he shows how these abstract philosophical ruptures, these 5 severances, didn't just stay in academic journals.
Not at all.
They manifested. They showed up in the built world and in our lived experience. And this is what he calls the great modern uniformities.
And this section is such a powerful counter-argument to the story modernity tells about itself. You know, a story of endless choice and variety.
Right.
Spiker shows that the obsession with rationalization actually created this rigid artificial uniformity. It was imposed by technology and administrative efficiency. It started with the dark satanic mills of William Blake and ended up with the identical glass and steel skyscrapers you see in every global city.
Okay, let's start with uniformity 1. Rationalization in the urban environment and architecture. How does denying metaphysics change how we build our homes and cities?
Well, architecture traditionally was meant to reflect something: cultural values, spiritual beliefs, a connection to place. Spiker argues that modern architecture, which is born directly out of Severance 4, that Cartesian split and the removal of purpose, now explicitly denies absolutes, objective morality, and the essence of things.
It just sees space as something to be quantified.
Exactly. Which is where functionalism, championed by Le Corbusier, comes in.
Le Corbusier, the father of modern architecture.
He prioritized quantifiable, symmetrical, purely functional designs. And this wasn't just a style choice. It was an ideological statement. The designs were meant to be efficient, interchangeable, universal. Spiker uses the example of Le Corbusier's infamous project to build 18 identical tower blocks in Paris.
The building itself becomes a celebration of the machine.
It becomes a religious architecture celebrating the religion of progress, and it's completely devoid of local character or spiritual meaning.
So architecture moves from reflecting a divine order to celebrating administrative efficiency.
That's the shift. And the result is the creation of this generic, uniform space that actively destroys local cultural identity. I mean, think about it. A person wakes up in a five-star hotel in Dubai, or a Starbucks in London, or a McDonald's kitchen in Shanghai.
They have no idea where they are.
They literally cannot tell where they are in the world because the environment has been totally homogenized. It's the IKEAization of the apartment. It's a physical imposition of outward uniformity that comes directly from a philosophy that denies the unique essence of place.
And this homogeneity in space is then mirrored in the economy. Let's move to uniformity 2, industrialization and the loss of craft.
This is the shift from the guild system to mass industrial production.
What was lost in that shift?
The guild system emphasized community, skill, a deep, sometimes spiritual connection to the craft itself. The industrial system, which is born from the utilitarian goals of Severance 4 and the pragmatic ethics of Severance 5, just replaced all of that with mass production focused only on efficiency and profit.
And this shift was tied directly to finance and colonialism, wasn't it?
Inextricably. Spiker emphasizes that this whole technological shift was funded by a financial revolution, the creation of the English stock market and the Bank of England in the late 1600s.
And what did that do?
Those financial tools provided the massive amounts of capital needed to fund colonial projects like the East India Company. And this established utility and productivity, all driven by money interest, as the sole aims of human work.
This is the defining feature of the mechanical age, as Thomas Carlyle called it.
Spiker quotes Carlyle's observation from 1829. He characterized the age not as devotional or philosophical or moral, but explicitly as the mechanical age.
And what was Carlyle's crucial insight?
His insight was that the great art of this new age is adapting men to machines. And that just captures the enforced uniformity perfectly. Human beings themselves have to be molded, rationalized, standardized uniformity of labor to serve the insatiable needs of the machine, the factory, the market.
And finally, we get to the deepest, most internal consequence of all this. Uniformity 3, social relationships and the internet age.
This is where we see the ultimate product of the severances, the creation of the solipsistic individual.
The individual who is totally wrapped up in themselves.
Obsessed with personal passion and self-definition, often completely divorced from any real community or tradition. It's a direct consequence of Severance 5, that separation of morality and being. The machine culture replaces authentic, meaningful engagement with just distraction. And that leads to a collective malaise, the rise of what he calls pure boredom.
He cites T.S. Eliot here, right? That observation that real skills, like playing an instrument or even just walking, are replaced by passive consumption.
The gramophone, the cheap motor car, if every authentic human engagement is replaced by a mechanized, standardized substitute, you get mass alienation.
And that alienation completely redefines our social bonds.
It does. Friendship, which used to be based on shared sacrifice, on intimacy, on a shared moral world, it becomes abstract, conditional, digitized.
You create these curated, abstract identities, our little alternate egos on digital platforms. And the relationships are so fragile that the slightest disagreement, the slightest criticism leads to being unfriended.
It's the logical endpoint of the fragmentation of the self. And Spiker warns that even traditional religious practices and hierarchies are being dismantled by this mindset.
Only by people who think they're resisting the West.
Especially by them. They reject traditional authority, the concept of taqlid, because it conflicts with their modern, individualistic desire for a direct, unmediated interpretation of everything.
But they don't return to a rigorous traditional method. They just substitute one authority for another.
Exactly. They often end up substituting a stable local hierarchy rooted in centuries of tradition for the influence of some anonymous, often totally ignorant figure they find online, the Jahil.
So they reject the old hierarchy for a new, transient, global, and anonymous one rooted in technology.
The irony is profound. And the final paradox here is just stark. While our elites talk about transhumanism, about moving beyond our biological limits, the practical lived reality for most people is subhumanism.
A collective regression.
A regression of meaningful human engagement, identity, and moral coherence.
This is the crucial synthesis that Spiker provides. The crisis isn't just outward, in our cities and our tech. It's fundamentally inward. It's in our mentality, our spirituality.
And if you accept the outward model of modernity, the technology, the efficiency, the economic system, as the only measure of progress,
then you are implicitly accepting the inward philosophical failures, the five severances that created it.
the outward uniformity, dressing like the West, speaking its languages, consuming its standardized media, is presented as the only way to be progressive and relevant. Spiker's warning is clear. This outward uniformity is the premise that leads to and enforces inward uniformity. We internalize the belief that to get ahead, we have to abandon tradition, abandon the pursuit of objective truth for the simple expediency of catching up. #HagOutro. At the end of the day, Spiker's book really serves as an admonition to the heedless. The Arabic is tanbi al-ghafilin, a profound, rigorous warning to anyone, but especially those in the Muslim world, who are still mesmerized by Western thought, its institutions, its technology. He's urging the learner, please do not join the bandwagon of a collapsing system.
A system that is actively discrediting itself on the world stage every single day.
And his point is that now is not the time to be climbing aboard the wagon. It's the time for intellectual offloading. To double down on this collapsing order now is to join a sinking ship and hope for salvage.
It's too late.
The urgency for intellectual renewal, according to Spiker, has to begin at the most elemental level of discourse, at the metaphysical and the moral level. We have to fundamentally question the entire order of things that underlies modern life.
Especially, he says, because the main cause of intellectual disempowerment around the world is the internalization of the West's own criteria for what empowerment even means.
You're accepting the terms of your own submission.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you try to navigate this rapidly fragmenting world? If we accept Spiker's argument that the very essence of modernity is defined by these historical removals, the separation of divine law from life, of faith from reason, of morality from existence.
The question we have to ask ourselves is this. Is the ongoing global quest for progress truly advancing humanity toward something better, toward more coherence and stability?
Or is it merely reinforcing those five historical ruptures that inevitably lead to the intellectual and moral chaos that we're all witnessing today?
A powerful and, I think, necessary challenge to the foundations we so often take for granted.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the unraveling of intelligibility. We hope this gives you much to mull over and explore further.